Hello and welcome to the Standards Meeting Update for December 2018. Thank you for joining us. I want to wish everybody happy holidays, and I hope that those of you that are celebrating towards the end of the year have an enjoyable time off if you're taking it, and if not, I hope things are slow enough that you'll be able to reflect on the things that have occurred over the past year. I am your host, Joel Welch, SMPTE's Director of Education. Thank you for joining us, as I said before. And we have two parts to our webcast today, which I will get into in just a moment. But before I hand the floor over to our guest speakers, I'd like to do just a little bit of housekeeping as we normally do. And first of all, the SMPTE Technology Committee meeting outcome summaries are a series of interactive webcasts that summarize the activities of the most recent SMPTE Technology Committee meetings. They happen, I think, 4 times a year, and they do a lot of work at those meetings to make sure that SMPTE standards work is progressing, but also that existing standards stay current and relevant. It says interactive. We would like to invite our guests to ask questions, preferably to ask oral questions. That means typing into the question box, I would like to ask an oral question or something to that effect. And then when the time comes, I will unmute you. You can speak directly to the presenters and get a direct answer back. If you don't have a microphone or you just prefer not to speak to the presenters for one reason or another, just type your question into the question box and I will read it on your behalf. SMPTE standards related webcasts are free to everybody. We provide them complimentary to everybody, not only the live webcast, but also the recordings, which are published for on-demand viewing on the SMPTE website, but also YouTube. If you do participate in social media, whether you tweet, snap, use Facebook, whatever social media you use, please tell your friends about the webcast that SMPTE produces. And our handle for Twitter is at SMPTE Connect, and the hashtag is hashtag SMPTE Webcast. We have 3 speakers today because we are going to hear from Bruce Devlin and Thomas Bause Mason, who are involved with the overall standards development program for SMPTE. But special guest speaker John Footen is going to do an overview of microservices, which is a topic of pretty great interest these days. Gentlemen, without further delay, I am going to turn the floor over to you and stop talking. And I'm sorry, Bruce, but you are muted.
How about that? So try a second go, see if I can master the technology. I'm guessing that there's no complaints, therefore I must be speaking out loud.
Bruce, you're good.
I will be turning off my webcam in a second because there's not much bandwidth here, and if the webcam's on, the voice doesn't work so well. So, but what I did want to show you is that we've got one of these fantastic I Survived the SMPTE 2018 Technology Committee t-shirts. We've got a few of those left. So if you would like one of those, please let us know via the chat or drop an email to Thomas, and we will give them out in order of requests received until such time as we either run out or we can't find any more. And with that, I'm going to turn off my webcam. There we go. So today we're going to be going through the outcome of the December standards meetings. These were hosted by Dolby in wonderful San Francisco. We had some quite spectacular weather, some beautiful sunrises and lovely approach. There was also some interesting stairs that we had to climb every day, and not everybody was as perky as me and Matthew and Thomas getting to the top of them. We had a fantastic film presentation in Dolby Cinema, and there was some fantastic food. So it really was a great spread put on by Dolby. We were there for 4 days. There were 2 parallel streams at sometimes. Last quarter, we didn't publish many documents, but there's a lot in the pipeline. At the Dolby meetings, we had 65 people on site, over 100 people total participating in the meetings, and currently within SMPTE, we have 187 active projects. And this presentation is just the summary of what went on. If any of it takes your fancy or you want to find out more details, please have a look at that URL there. That will lead you to the outcome report when we finally publish it, which should be in a few days' time, I hope. And you have access there to all the previous outcome reports as well. Just a quick reminder of how we organize ourselves. Within the standard structure, we have 10 technology committees comprising 816 members over 34 countries, distributed around into 350 plus companies. I tried counting them all. I think it came to 354 this time around. As I said, we have 187 active projects. Basically, one project covers one document. So that's roughly the number of documents that are in flight at the moment. And they're divided into 104 different working groups because some groups have more than one document. At the head of the standards organization, there is me, the standards vice president, and my right-hand man, Thomas Bause-Mason, who's the director of standards development. So Thomas, who I think can unmute.
Yeah.
Excellent. There we go. Just to check that you're there, Thomas. So Thomas, you're SMPTE staff, and I'm a volunteer. And Thomas, would you like to talk us through the rest of the standards organization?
I can. We have 4 standards directors in the standards committee. We have the 18 TC chairs. I think we have 10 technology committees, but some of them just have one chair. So that makes up the, most of them have 2. So that makes up the number of 18. There's one subgroup chair who is invited to the meetings as well. And then we have we have staff. That's the staff which reports to me, Carissa and Mauricio, and then me, and then the previous standards vice president, who's Alan Lamchat. As I said, we have 10 TCs, and they're going across the different fields of technology for professional media. We have Essence, that's mezzanine, codecs, film. Yeah, people still use film, and I heard it becomes a little bit more popular now. Digital cinema, television and broadband, looking at some television technologies. We have 25 CSS, which is cinema sound systems, that looks at everything related to audio in cinemas. 30MR, metadata and registries. And then we have 31FS, that's file formats and systems. 32NF, network facilities, that's everything to interface between systems. 34CS, it's kind of like web services oriented. It's really about communication protocols between systems. And then TC 35PM, that's our media packaging, and most of you known as IMF. That's pretty much it. Back to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Thomas. And just a reminder that most of the posts, the chairs and the worker bees, they're all volunteers. We only have 3 SMPTE staff dedicated to standards, and they're very busy all of the time. And the rest of the organization is a volunteer organization. Now, in these standards webcasts, we always ask the question about what you would like to see at the next presentation. The next one will be in March, after we have our March meetings. It's time for another deep dive. So really, it's a question of, would you like, option 1, would you like us to find an expert to talk to you about time labeling and the replacements for timecode. That's part of the SMPTE 2120 work. Would you like to hear about everything that's happening in the world of dynamic metadata for high dynamic range? In other words, how does it get labeled? How does it get carried? How does it make it to the far end? Or would you like to find out about OBID? In other words, how do you get IDA and ADD identifiers buried into the audiovisual signal and get them to the end user? So have a think about that, and towards the end of the presentation, after John's told us about microservices, we will put up a quick poll and you can have a quick vote. So kicking off with the new projects that have been started this meeting cycle. So there's only 5 projects this time around. The first one is a digital cinema project to look at digital sync signals and auxiliary data transfer protocols. This was highlighted because other documents were being revised and they realized there was a dependency on this document that needed to be updated. So this is one that needs to be updated to unblock some other work that's happening within SMPTE. In cinema sound, we've got the B chain, which is all the post-production houses and all the previews. How do we set up those environments so that we can have consistent immersive audio? This is things like MPEG-H and DTS and DTSX and Atmos, or Atmos, depending on which country you're in. The next new project is to schedule through the release of the metadata registers. The current release is nicknamed Tabasco, and because it's software-y, of course, all the software folks have to give them code names. And that will basically update the whole of SMPTE RA. We've got a new RDD being proposed in 31FS, which is file formats and systems, to put uncompressed DNX, which is in an AVID format. That RDD will be going through and putting that format into MXF. And then again, a dependent project. This work actually started off in the IMF group, where we were trying to generate some vocabularies for multi-channel audio labeling, and that work was better off actually taking place in the home of multi-channel audio labeling, which is the 31FS group. And again, this is an interesting piece of work because we're trying to move the world away from having audio arrangements based on channel numbers and moving it towards having metadata which identifies what the audio is, identifies what the language is, and identify what it's used for. Now, the slides for this will be updated, will be uploaded to the standards community. We have public links to all the projects that SMPTE has, and because we've updated some of the links, Google is now starting to find them. So if you search Google for SMPTE public projects, there is probably a 50-50 chance at the moment that Google will give you this link, and we're hoping that will be a 100% chance early in the new year. Likewise, we publish our public documents. These are things like IPR statements and our administrative guidelines. Those are available here. And all the rules by which SMPTE follows the administrative guidelines and the operations manuals, those are all here, and they're all online and they're all in the public domain. So if you're having trouble sleeping over the Christmas period, I thoroughly recommend a good look at the administrative guidelines. So we'll kick off, and I'll try and rattle through these relatively quickly. I'll pause at the end of each section, and if you have questions, please just type something into the chat. So the first technology committee is 10E, which is all about essence, video, audio, and data essence. There aren't any new projects in this particular group at the moment. The first set of projects I talk about are to do with video compression. We have 3 video compression projects which are currently going through the process. The first one is SMPTE 2117. The trade name for that one is Perseus. And basically this is a new codec being standardized for the first time. And we're doing a lot of drafting and trying to get all of the concepts written down in such a way that they're understandable to the newbie. To try and test the document that we've created, the proponents, they've actually started work on a reference decoder, which is a clean room implementation of the decoder based solely on the document as written so far. The target is to get our final committee draft ballot sorted in early 2019, and there'll be a bunch of webinars to help educate people on the concept. So if you're interested at all in this video compression standard, then look out for the FCD ballot start and look out for the webinars, because we'll try and teach the 10E committee everything about VC6 so that they can do a good vote on the document. So this one is just at the beginning of its process. The next one is reaching the end of its process. So VC5, commonly known as Cineform or the GoPro codec. The final document in the suite, the metadata document, has just passed its FCD ballot. It's got a number of comments, I think 40 odd comments actually. These are being worked on at the moment by Brian Chunk and the team. And because there's been a few tweaks to the metadata standard, the conformance and reference decoder have had to be updated to match this update to the document suite. The final update to video codecs at the moment is 2042. That's known as VC2 and also known as Dirac. So this has been updated to include some high dynamic range and wide color gamut. That should be WCG, not WBG. So that's currently in progress. It's a bit of a slow process at the moment, but that is chugging through the system. Hopefully I haven't clicked twice. There we go, right. There are a number of other projects going on in 10E. The first is about a reference display. As you know, we're starting the high dynamic range world, and having a reference display that's calibrated against calibrated for its environment is an important thing, so that we know what we're looking at and we know that two monitors are calibrated the same. So that's what ST2080 is, and an FCD ballot has been restarted for that document, and that will be finishing off on the 11th of January, and expecting a few comments to appear there, and for those comments to be resolved relatively quickly in that document to get through early in the new year. So the measurement and calibration procedure really does require the measurement and calibration document to be complete, so the part 2 is dependent on part 4. We then have a document about television lighting consistency, which is a way of measuring whether or not your LED lights are consistent in their illumination. It's had a clarification in the way the mathematics within that document works, and now it's undergoing its second pre-FCD review. So that will be kicking off relatively soon, I'm guessing in the new year, and I expect that the proponents will want that to be hitting some sort of ballot just before the March meetings. We then have a document called Dynamic Metadata for Color Volume Transform. It has a number of different applications in it. This one, application 4, is undergoing a review. It was originally published in 2016, and there were some issues with the document that some people who were investigating it discovered. And so an awful lot of work is going on in this particular drafting group at the moment to try and get this document shipshape and ready for publication. So there are a number of issues identified. The proponents are working really hard to clarify all the text and get all of those fixed. And I know that they want that to happen very quickly, and they're working on trying to get that fixed early in the new year. We have a document, SMPTE 2113, P3 colorimetry. That's reaching the end of its standardization process. It's now an ST audit. And effectively, this document defines the colorimetry of the well-used P3 color space. Interestingly, it was a temporary color space early on, but there's so much content around in that P3 color space, it felt there was a need to standardize what that P3 color space was. A couple of documents, full FS gamut and FS log characteristics of camera systems. Those are going through. They have been undergone their first FCD ballot. All the comments have been resolved, and those are now ready for DP vote to make certain that in fixing those comments, no modifications were made that cause errors in the document. In parallel, we have a study group on virtual reality and augmented reality. That's been going round the loop a few times to try and figure out what the right report to create is. And that's interesting because there's quite a lot of VR, AR groups around at the moment. And it seems that in the 18 months this group has been looking around to try and look at the professional VR, AR space, that the fashion has gone away from virtual reality and is now heading more towards augmented reality. So a short report is being put together to detail some of the things that were discovered during this study group's activities and to try and explain some of the activity that's going on in the professional VR and AR space. Almost certainly geared towards AR, augmented reality, rather than virtual reality. There was also a presentation given from the Academy of Motion Pictures, Art and Sciences on Spectral Similarity Index. So a bit like the Television Lighting Consistency Index, this is a piece of scientific work that's been done to look at modern lighting devices and whether or not two LED lights, for example, or an LED light and a tungsten light are actually giving you an illumination that is spectrally similar. You see these issues in post when you've got two lighting sources of lighting that are very dissimilar used to light a scene. And when you get into post, you suddenly discover that you can't make the corrections you thought you were going to do because of the spectral characteristics of the light illuminating the scene. So this is a very interesting piece of work, and we're expecting to have some good collaboration with the Academy on those topics. So that's the work of TC10E. I'm just going to pause for a second and see if there are any questions.
And we do have one question, Bruce. If someone would like to see a new project begin, a new standard,
Yep.
what's the basic process for getting involved or to getting it started?
What an excellent question. So all SMPTE work is done by proponents and done by volunteers. So if you have a project that you believe needs to come to SMPTE, the first port of call is usually our Director of Standards Development, Thomas Bause Mason. And to talk through the nature of the project with Thomas, and Thomas can give advice on whether it feels like an RDD or an engineering guideline or a recommended practice or a standard or a technical specification.
Yeah.
From that point,
Sorry.
so I was just going to give a quick run through the fact that the SVP, once it starts, then decides which technology it's going to be in. We write a document to say what the scope of the project is, and then effectively work can then start. But to go through how you make those decisions, I was now going to pass over to Thomas. Thomas, tell us how we make those decisions.
Yeah, I don't know if you mentioned the Administrative Guideline 06, and that is a form which you can download from the SMPTE website. It's, I think, together with the SMPTE bylaws, and that's a form which guides you through a list of information you have to provide to us so we can make this happen. And once we have that received, we can determine where we put the new effort and then create a project. And once we have approval from the project by the technology committee where this effort is posted, then we can start the working group and then invite people to start the work. There's a slightly different project approval process for RDDs, which for one require a payment of a fee, and for TSPs also which require a payment of a fee. But that's kind of the process.
It's worth also mentioning that if you're well organized and well documented and the standard or document is relatively short and relatively straightforward, you can get most of the processes done in under 6 months if you're well organized. If your document's very long and very complicated and you have hundreds of people in your drafting group and they all have strong opinions, the thing that takes the time is very often trying to get people to agree and not the process itself. The process is designed to be slick. If you have hundreds of people, it might take a while to get people to agree. But they all start the same way with that AG06 and with Thomas.
Yeah, and we're going to work in the new year on improving the SMPTE website to put up a little bit more information on how these processes work and how you can apply.
Excellent. So the next technology committee is Film 20F, and there was no 20F meeting in this cycle, so nothing to report on that one. Then we have 21DC, which is the Digital Cinema Technology Committee. The chair is Dean Bullock and Chris Witham, and they talk about all things digital cinema. As I mentioned earlier on, one new project has been started, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. There are a number of projects that involve revisions and updates to existing documents, such as these. The SMPTE 428 is the Digital Cinema Digital Master. So there's been some updates to those, the image characteristics and adding Japanese subtitle support, as well as some of the operational constraints. There are a couple of different updates to this particular one to add frame rates such as 100 frames per second and to add subtitles. And because these were two different amendments and revisions going along in parallel, they all sort of came together just at the very last moment for the ST audit, and those two different parallel updates are being merged by HQ. There's also been an update to the carriage of JPEG 2000 in MXF for DCP packaging, and that's currently passed its DCP vote and should end up in ST audit and published very early in the new year. One of the big things that happened about 3 months ago was the publication of the Immersive Audio Standards, SMPTE 2098. And as a result of that, there's been some updates of documents that depended on that, such as 429.18, which is how you make a DCP track file, and ST 429.19, which are the operational constraints for immersive audio. There's also an RDD, which is the Atmos bitstream specification that has now gone through to publication and should be appearing in the store anytime now. Also coupled with the immersive audio work is this update. This is a document that needs to be modified as a result of the publication of 2098 Part 2. So the draft of that got done really pretty quickly, and it's now waiting on a pre-FCD review so that it can then go through to ballot. Likewise, SMPTE 430 Part 18, the OMB COM reference model, that's waiting for pre-FCD review. I think it's actually waiting the same human resources that 430-17 is waiting on. We talked about the digital sync and aux data transfer protocol, and there's a couple of others that need to be updated. So all of these things have basically got updated as a result of the publication of the immersive audio standard. So that's a quick run through 21DC, and I'll just have a quick pause, see if anybody has any questions.
And our queue is clear of questions, but I would like to remind our guests that if you'd like to ask a question, there are two ways to do it. The preferred way is to just type into the question box, "I'd like to ask an oral question." I'll unmute you. Or if you don't have a microphone, just type your question and I'll read the question on your behalf. And no questions, so we should proceed.
Thank you, Joel. And just to point out that Dean Bullock, after spending 2 years chairing 21DC, is now stepping down, and Steve Lamb from Deluxe is taking his place. Next committee up is 24DTB. That is currently chaired by, chaired by Bill Miller. And I have a co-chair for him waiting in the wings, who I hope to announce at the next one of these in March. Only a few projects in 24DTB at the moment. We've got the 2064 suite on audio-video sync measurements. There's an engineering guideline that's been drafted. I can't remember what part number that's going to be. I think it's going to be 3. It's ready for its pre-FCD review. That's been bubbling along at slow pace for a little while now. We also have a revision to 2016 Part 1, which is the active format descriptor and bar data. It's been updated to include UHD widescreen signaling. That's still being drafted. And we have an EG21, which is the audio channel assignment for digital television tape recorders that have AES-EBU digital audio inputs. This thing has been around for a very, very long time and is pretty much of very, very little relevance other than in the archive community nowadays. So this is going to undergo a withdrawal ballot because really it's just for historical interest nowadays. So that was...
I'm sorry, I jumped in too quickly. We do have one question, Bruce. Would you remind us about the scope of 24TB, please?
Certainly. So 24TB is pretty much ancillary services. So this is all to do with signaling the size and shape of the screen, putting in audio description, audio signing, AV sync. So it's all the things around the audio video system without actually doing the audio video system itself. And so my guess is that sometime next year, because of some work that's going on in the IMF community, there might be an interesting little project appearing in 24TB, if I look in my my crystal ball, to do with multiple video streams all trying to hit the TV at the same time. And hopefully the new co-chair of 24TB will accept the role and will kick that work off early next year.
Hey, this is John. Just one quick question on all of that. You mentioned, I think, in 10E that there was a project around audio assignment metadata. So basically looking at audio not as channels, but as what it functionally is supposed to accomplish.
Yes.
So that's not in 24TB that because it's audio related, or?
Yeah, that one's a bit more fundamental because it's to do with the immersive audio and its sort of non-channel nature. If it ended up being a metadata signaling at the system level rather than the audio channel level, it might end up in 24TB. It really comes down to the whim of the standards vice president at the time the project's created. And as the world migrates and becomes more metadata oriented, it's likely that some of these historical assignments might change. Did that answer the question, or did I just add to the confusion?
No, that absolutely did answer the question. There's a little bit of overlap, and some things might move as it might make sense, but I got it.
Yep. And also, it's a little bit depending on the technology committee chair. If I propose it to a particular technology committee and they hide under the desk and the other one stands up, then the person standing will get the job. So the next technology committee is the Cinema Sound Systems Committee, which you have to say slowly, chaired by Brian Long and Bill Redmond. And as the name suggests, this is all to do with cinema sound systems and making things sound consistent both in the theatre and in all the chain that feeds content into the theatre. So the big one that was published about 3 months ago was SMPTE 2098 Part 2, the Immersive Audio Bitstream Specification. As soon as that was published, it went straight into a revision because it was felt that it was such an important document we had to get that out because it impacted a whole bunch of other documents. The IMF work that depended on that document basically opened the document up straight away, and it went straight into a revision to cover some of the IMF features that are required in SMPTE 2098 Part 2. So that's gone from publication into revision into FCD ballot in only 3 months, which is some kind of speed record. Part 1, which is the metadata, which describes the immersive audio bitstream. And again, this is to do with Atmos and DTSX and MPEG-H and all these other immersive audio standards. That metadata is in Part 1. That's already been published. And the renderer, the expectations on how it's going to behave, now that we've got the bitstream specified, where the drafting group is now carrying on with the EG, the engineering guideline on the expectations for the renderer, and the RP on how to do interoperability testing. Those are plugging through now. The B-chain characteristics and expectations, in other words, what does everything that's not the theatre have to do in order to implement that lot, that has now started to meet. They've got a 2-week meeting cadence, and they've held their first meeting now that 2098 Part 2 is published. And that covers 25 CSS Any questions on that one?
Our question queue has a lot of white space at the moment.
Cool. I will plug on to metadata and registers then. This is chaired by John Hurst and Mike DeValue, and it covers pretty much all the magic numbers you need to plug into MXF, into digital cinema, into blanking, all the magic numbers that make the TV and cinema ecosystem work. Got a bunch of projects chugging through. There's quite a lot of work pending on UMIDs, the Universal Material ID. This is like a magic random number that gets put into the headers of MXF files and into blanking of TV systems. There's a very small group working on it, and they're a bit starved of resources at the moment, and pretty much everything is dependent on this document, ST330, which is the UMID revision. So this is the defining document for UMIDs. That is awaiting its pre-FCD review because there's still a little bit of work required to be done by the drafting committee. So I'm hoping they'll get that done prior to March, and that will unblock these other documents in the queue, specifically the study group on applications of UMID, who are trying to figure out how to use these things, a UMID resolution protocol, a group that says, here's a UMID, where do I find it? And a recommended practice that talks about some of the applications of UMID and the best way to handle them. Also within 30MR, we have a new register, which is for essence element keys. So an essence element is an element that contains essence. So essence is video and audio and data that has a timeline associated with it. And we have a register of all the keys that you find in MXF files that contain things like ACEs, that contain H.264, H.265, that contain DV, contain MPEG-2. So all the essence types that you can think of, we have different element types that contain essence, and that's what this register is intended to do. It's reaching the end of its process now, so it's awaiting pre-DP review, and once this document is through and finally published, it will unblock specifically this bit of work down here, which is a drafting group which is maintaining an essence element spreadsheet, so that when the spreadsheet, when this document is published, they can undo the spreadsheet and junk all of the elements straight into the new register, which is defined by this document. So this says, how does the register work? And here are the sort of this is the holding pen for the data values to fill up that register. One of the defining documents, ST335, which defines all of our metadata elements, that's been revised to bring it up to date, and that's now ready for ST audit. So the new version of that is going to be published early in the new year. We have a new document, Professional Metadata, RDD 49. That has passed its RDD ballot, and that will be entering its publication cycle very soon. And similarly, the next revision of all of the metadata registers, so this is putting all of the published values which have gone through all of their SMPTE processes, pushing those out into the wild so that they'll appear on SMPTERA.org. This next revision, codenamed Tabasco, that's entering its publication cycle now, and we hope to get all of that done in between the March and the June meetings. In case you haven't been there recently, all of these magic numbers are available for free. Yes, free, at the four-letter word that begins with F from SMPTE, SMPTERA.org. Click on that, go to the metadata registers, and you can pull down many megabytes of XML, many megabytes of binary data, depending on how you want to look at it, and a whole bunch of documentation that talks you through how the registers work, what the values are, what they mean, that can be used either by people designing systems or even people who are designing products who need to use the data in both hardware and software. There's a lot of online documentation. Anybody who needs to know how these registers work and needs to know how the data values work, I thoroughly recommend going to SMPTERA.org and browsing around because it's free. And that concludes metadata and registers. Do we have any questions?
We have one question. If a company wants to see a new metadata standardized, for example, augmented reality or virtual reality metadata, how did they get that into the register?
What a very good question. So the register is effectively a snapshot of the data from a defining document. So a defining document might be a standard, it might be a recommended practice, it might be an engineering guideline, but not necessarily one from SMPTE. As long as the defining document has undergone some due process and is in the public domain, which means that you can get it. It doesn't mean you can get it for free, but it means that you can get it. Providing you can make a reference to that value, at that point, we have a document called AG18, which talks you through the process. And essentially, if I go back a slide, that process says, on the SMPTE RA site, you will see that there is a development area where you can put down the XML token, the binary value, the title, the description, and all the related properties. In other words, if it's a group, what group is it? What are the other members of that group? So all the things you need to do to define this big register, you write down an XML and you submit it here in the development area. And our document editors then inspect it to make certain that there's been no clashes. And assuming that everything's gone well, these magic numbers then become mature metadata values, which then typically allows the standardization process for the defining document to finish, because there's a bit of a causality issue here. So once the document entries are mature in our registration process, the standardization of the defining document can then complete, but the defining document knows that those values will be held forever and will never change. So even if the defining document never makes it through the standardization process, no other document will ever be able to use those magic values in the register. And pretty much if you're doing it within SMPTE, all of that's free. And if you're doing it as an external organization, there is a small nominal fee written down somewhere, but in practice, nearly everybody does it within SMPTE. So recap that really, really quickly. You upload some XML here, and the XML is a copy of the values in some defining document. The defining document should be a publicly available standard of some kind or some due process document. And typically, when you start this process, that document isn't finished, and that document typically finishes first, and then the register entry gets published second. So I will assume that that's answered the question, as I don't see a follow-up. The next committee is file formats and systems. So this is pretty much anything that's a file format or the use of that file format, typically MXF. So we've got a couple of new projects coming along. The first one is RDD48, which is an RDD from Avid to take their DNX coding environment and explain how to package that and map it into MXF. And as far as I understand it, RDD48 will be a constraint of a standard called ST384. We also have a revision of a document called ST377 Part 4, which is the multi-channel audio framework. And that basically explains how to put metadata into an MXF file or an MXF ecosystem, not necessarily a file, but into an MXF ecosystem, so that you can identify the channel, whether it's left or right or surround left or surround right or left total, right total, all the various sound field names that exist. It identifies the channel grouping and it identifies a whole bunch of other things like what kind of sound is it? Is it intended for stereo? Is it intended as a stem? Is it intended as a movie? So all of these vocabularies have been worked on, and as these vocabularies get updated, this document gets revised to include the new vocabularies, and those vocabularies get inserted as dictionaries or registers within 377 Part 4. So the work for this revision was actually started in the IMF group and has now ended up in the 31FS group as an update to 377 Part 4. Now within the MXF work itself, there's a few documents that have been lurking for a little while. 3 of them are in my bag because I've been a bit busy being SVP, but essentially we've done the last revision of 377 Part 1 that references the old registers, and then from this point onwards we'll start to reference the new registers, and that's a big old bit of work. we're looking for volunteers to try and help us out with that work. We've also got a thing called KLV extension syntax, which is a way of extending MXF without so that it can be extended at runtime, and MXF decoders are able to look at the extensions and understand what the extensions mean. The MXF descriptive metadata scheme 1 is ready for its pre-DP review. That's a relatively old document with relatively few, in other words, not many implementations, and the goal for that one is to stabilize it and then pour concrete on it and never change it again. This is probably the last revision it will ever do. We have a revision of how you put XML in MXF. There are 5 comments still to revise on that one. And we've got a mapping of VC2, which is the Dirac encoder with its UHD enhancements into MXF. And that document is in the publication queue and should be published before the next meeting in March. The archive exchange format work is still proceeding. They're looking at how you bundle together external documents and put them into AXF in a consistent way where you don't have any kind of metadata morphology and good namespace handling. And we have a document that was a struggle to get done, and all credit to the guys who worked on this one, trying to take DPX and add high dynamic range to it. That was always a courageous thing to do, and they've managed to get agreement across the industry, a fantastic piece of work, and that is now in the publication queue. So I'll just pause and see if anybody has questions on 31FS.
And we have no questions at this time.
In that case, I will jump straight into networks and facilities. And this is all things SDI and IP. So the first project is one of our big flagship projects, and I don't feel qualified to talk about it, but there's a man on this call who is. Thomas, would you like to tell us a little bit about the SG on security?
Actually, I was missing this in your new projects, on your new product slide. So I'm happy that we're actually going to talk about this here. It's a very focused effort to look into how we can secure ST 2059, or the SMPTE version of PTP. It's a study group, so we're going to look at what standardization we might have to create to protect ST 2059, and are there any standards we have to update. This comes out of a larger effort undertaken by the EBU and the JTNM, who looked at the broader picture of security in IP infrastructure. And the focus really was on, let's see what low-hanging fruits we have. And one of them was PTP security. You can imagine that if your facility runs on PTP and there is some interference, that can topple your whole infrastructure and your whole facility. So it's looking at how to harden the PTP infrastructure, how to harden PTP equipment, and how to design networks running PTP effectively and protecting them against outside interference. We had our first meeting yesterday, so it's kicking off. We're going to continue next year after the holidays and after CES.
Do you want to just say a little bit about the liaisons and the JTNM and how this is almost a focus for an industry effort rather than just be a SMPTE anything?
Yeah, there is some effort in the JTNM to look at the full stack of IP infrastructure. So you may know SMPTE ST 2110, and that is just the transport part of in the IP infrastructure for audio, video, and data. So there were a bit of misunderstanding by some that if you have ST 2110 equipment, that you're done and you have your IP infrastructure. There are more parts to it. There's the whole control plane part to it, and also security. So the full stack discussion is really what's happening in the JTNM, and they came out with a document, JTNM TR 1001, and which looks at this full stack system, and then security can be one part of it. And the output of the study group could be seen as a contribution to that effort.
Excellent, thank you, Thomas. So this is going to be a big thing, and probably the start of several security efforts going on in SMPTE across quite a broad slew of different areas where SMPTE is going to be important. And what we're trying to do is do this in bite-sized bits. It could quite easily turn into an ocean boiling exercise, and Thomas has been really good at trying to keep the scope of this first project relatively small so that we can get some work done and we can actually get some results out to the greater industry. So I'm really looking forward to the output of this one. So other projects going on within 32NF. The first group of projects are all to do with high dynamic range and wide color gamut signaling and UHD SDI interfaces and all that kind of stuff. So the first one is an engineering guideline, which is a huge poster, which if you're a subscriber to the journal, you will have seen or will see. Interestingly, we had an interoperability issue about how we actually edit a file that's so huge. So that was an interesting thing, and how do we archive it for the rest of eternity? The ironic part of my brain says, hey, we should use AXF for that, so we should eat our own standards, but we'll get to that sometime in the future, I hope, when this product's out there. The next bunch of standards are really all looking at how do you do high dynamic range signaling on links, and a lot of those are in draft publication or awaiting draft publication or just getting into pre-FCD. So there's been a lot of work going on in this area for about a year, and the documents are chugging through one by one. And so this group of documents is essentially the last slew of these documents with all of the HDR metadata available within them. SMPTE 2038 ancillary packets in MPEG-2 TS is a little bit of an outlier, but that one again needed a revision. That revision has got to the point where pre-FCD comments are being looked at. Then if we look at our video over IP standards, the 2110 Part 22, which is the compressed mono essence streams over IP, there is a requirement to register different sorts of compression within SMPTE 2110, and so the right way to do that register, how do we do it for minimum bureaucracy, maximum throughput, yet still having a bit of due process diligence? There's been an amount of discussion on how we do that, and I think we managed to unblock that yesterday, literally about 20 minutes before the security SG started. I think we've unblocked that, and I think that document is now clear to the proponents how they're going to move forwards and how they're going to create that register. We've got how to put single essence over multiple ports. So if you've got a very bulky piece of essence like 8K video and you need to put it across multiple ports and then bring it all back together again, how do you do that? Well, that's what Part 23 is. That document's almost ready for its pre-FCD review. And then we've got FMX, fast metadata. In other words, if you've got metadata that in the SDI domain would live in video blanking, but you want to put it on IP, it doesn't make any sense at all to put it in blanking and then put the blanking on IP. Why don't you just put the metadata over IP, and that way you've got much better and cleaner access to that metadata. So the way in which you do that is 2110 Part 41, and the first of the objects that's going to sit inside that standard is the SDP object. So the SDP object is essentially the description object that describes the fields, or sorry, describes the stream, so that you can route that SDP object more efficiently along with the streams that you're trying to all put together. Then we have the 2022 family of documents. Those are being revised at the moment to look at how you put variable bitrate MPEG-2 transport streams on an IP network. That's undergoing its pre-DP review, so that one's nearly reaching the end of its standardization journey. Then there's the timing of 22 Part 6 streams, which is compressed upon ST21 2022 inside an ST2110 system. That's gone through, it's ready for ST audit and will be published early next year, and the seamless protection switching of RTP datagrams, which is 2022 Part 7, that's currently an ST audit, and again, that's going to pop out in the publication queue early next year. So you'll remember at the beginning of this talk, I said there weren't many documents published this quarter. That's because we've got an awful lot that are going to come out next quarter. Interestingly, an EG on synchronization has kind of mutated into an EG that explains how to transform your ecosystem from black burst. I don't know who BERT is, really should say burst. Migrating from black and burst to an ST2110 plus PTP ecosystem. How do you do that? So the guys are looking at how you would write an EG to do that process. 3 other areas of work within 32NF, which is the biggest of our technology committees. The first is on time labeling and synchronization. So the interop group on 2059, which is the PTP work, there is a new Dirty Hands workshop to do with full stack testing that includes 2059 interop. That will take place on the 18th of Feb in America. If you need to find out more about that, please get in touch with the 32NF chairs. Previous reports from that work are available on the SMPTE website. Parts of the document are being revised. 2059 Part 1 and 59 Part 2 are being revised based on the interop tests. Those are being drafted at the moment. And the EGs that tell you how to do the 2059 system, basically the management of discontinuities and the systemization, it's very likely that those are much more than just timing EGs, and those will migrate to be 2110 documents and not 2059 timing documents. However, the best practice for large-scale SMPTE 2059 PTP deployments, as a result of learning lots of practical experience in the interop tests, that document work is almost certainly going to be restarted, and they're going to tear up the current draft and start again. With all of this work going on defining timing, we need something that does the time labeling better than timecode. Timecode just doesn't cut it for these kinds of systems. So there's a new system being defined called the Extensible Time Label, or TLX, and the document suite has been chopped up into a number of different parts: the system, the items, and the profiles. And the initial profiles that are being looked at is a digital birth certificate. In other words, where did the content come from? Did it come from a CGI? Did it come from a camera? What's the local time profile? That's if you're in a studio or a system where you really care about the time on the wall and the time of the content as well. And then production time profile, which is like the hybrid of what is the virtual time elapsed during the particular production. The RP 2104 that's got definitions for date and time terms, that's pretty much been paused for a year or so now. I'm thinking that activity might start to kick up once this TLX activity starts to find its legs and go more into a documentation phase rather than a design phase. Another very active group is putting data over AS3, which is the SMPTE 337 group. The 2109 document, which is the audio metadata, that has just completed all its FCD ballot. All the comments were resolved as of earlier this morning, and we're going to be doing quite an extensive amount of liaison with the AES to try and make certain that there is no divergence between what SMPTE is doing and what the Audio Engineering Society is doing. So I have an action tomorrow morning to try and make certain that we get the liaisons between the two organizations working well for this document. We've also got the carriage of MPEG-H 3D audio streams and serial audio definition model, or ADM as it's more commonly referred to, over AS3. One of them is drafting a revised working draft because of some updates to the underlying technology, and this one's ready for its pre-FCD review. So that's our networking and facilities. The group has been running with just one chair recently, and I'm very grateful to Thomas Conan from Mellanox, who's stepped up to the plate and will be taking over as co-chair of that group from the 1st of January. Thank you very much, Thomas. Do we have any questions?
And we have one, and it's related to the security items I think that Thomas was speaking about previously. Could you expand on that? Will there be a larger effort in SMPTE around security and identity? Should there be a top-level committee on security in the future organization revision?
What an excellent question. And we did have a bit of a debate about that. And I think ultimately it's inevitable that there'll be a SMPTE TC on security. I think it's probably a little bit early just at the moment to start that TC. But my anticipation is that we will publish the report from this current study group. And before that's done, or while that's happening, that there will be 2 or 3 other security bits of work appearing within SMPTE. And at that point, I'm pretty certain that we'll be starting a new technology committee on security. And if you remember the overall structure of SMPTE, it'll be the Standards Committee, that top-level committee made up of all the TC chairs that will make that decision. And I'm guessing, I'm looking to my crystal ball now, that that's going to be in the second half of 2019 that we're likely to be doing something in that area. So as Niels Bohr, the famous physicist, said, it's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future. I believe it'll happen. Watch this space. And as the world of security becomes more interesting and more relevant, we will be doing more work. Thomas, did you want to chip in there as chair of the current group?
Yeah. I just wanted to mention that this effort really came out of a request from the JTNM. The JTNM is really kind of like an organization looking to harmonize the efforts in the industry. We are a founding member of that, and so the PTP security request came to us because we own the SMPTE ST 2059 standard. There are other organizations looking into other topics of security. There's, for example, AMWA looking at API security. So that was another request from the JTNM, and the EBU is very active on the topic of security as well. So there are other efforts in the industry, and we're trying not to duplicate what's happening in other organizations. So, but obviously I can only second what Bruce said. In the future, there might be a bigger effort in SMPTE looking at security.
Yeah, this is John. I'll just add that and I'll be talking about obviously about microservices in a little bit, but in that project, security is a big concern, and we will have to be addressing security as part of that project as well. So it's definitely a topic of great interest as we have more and more IP and computer-controlled systems.
Yeah, I think the fear in the whole discussion was that cybersecurity is obviously a very big topic, and it addresses also physical kind of entities and but also technical digital entities, let's say. But there was a fear that we might boil the ocean if we start too big. So the perception was really, let's start small and low-hanging fruits, get something out to the industry, and then see how we can improve.
Thank you. Now, I'm conscious that we're a little bit behind schedule, and I need to give you some time to talk, John, so I'm going to rattle through 34CS. So the big hitting items in 34CS, which is control and systems, is BXF, the broadcast exchange format. And there's a slew of documents, 4 of them, that are either through ST audit or awaiting ST audit. So essentially, BXF version 6 is about to hit the IEEE Explore shop anytime now. And requirements for BXF 7 are currently being gathered. We have a project called Media Device Control over IP. 2 of the documents, part 3 and part 4, the discovery and capability interface, the documents needed to be restructured, and the working drafts are being done within the drafting group, and liaisons with AES and other groups are taking place there. As a result of some of that liaison, we've got a proposal for the Open Directory architecture, and that proposal is come down indirectly by the Audio Engineering Society. So again, some good liaison work happening there. I'm not going to mention the media microservices overall architecture because, John, you're a much better expert than me, and you'll be able to tell us all about it after I've told people about 35 p.m. Now, do we have any questions about media systems and control? Looks like we don't, because John's the expert and he'll be talking about it in a second. So the last of our technology committees is Media Packing and Interchange, or the IMF group, chaired by Pierre Lemieux and Florian Schleich. So the documents here, we've got an interesting workflow, a kind of experimental workflow here, which is to use GitHub and GitHub issue tracking effectively to log issues as they arise in the IMF documents. And then we formulated a document maintenance group, which then goes through the issues and tries to figure out whether they're finger trouble, whether they really are issues with the standard, and what needs to be updated to address those issues. So those issues cover this group of documents: the core constraints, the composition playlist, the essence component or track files, and for some reason I put app2e in twice. There we go. I have 3 mistakes in my slide deck. Wasn't bodging amateur. So these are all in draft at the moment, and there is active discussion taking place on how to fix these issues. And because there's lots of different opinions and lots of different experts involved, we're finding that using this GitHub issue tracker is a really good way of working through the issues, and good collaborative working is taking place. I'm very impressed with the work going on within 35 p.m. for this collaborative working. RDD 47, isochronous stream of XML documents. This went through the whole process really quickly in under 6 months. And essentially this is if, for example, you had dynamic metadata where there was one XML document for every frame of video, how would you put them into an MXF track file so it would be IMF compliant? And that's what RDD 47 does. The Plugfest report that took place at the Academy on the 12th of October this year, that's currently being drafted and is nearing completion, and will be available for distribution amongst the committee very soon. The next Plugfest will be in Europe, and it will be in the middle of next year. We've got a new document, which is the immersive audio bitstream in IMF, that has completed most of its journey, is awaiting its SD audit and will be published early next year. And we've got 2 new documents which have just nipped in just at the very last moment in between the meetings in San Francisco and now. And these are a revision to the business requirements for app DPP and an app DPP neighbor, which is some North American Broadcasters Association constraints on how to use JPEG 2000 in a broadcast ecosystem. And that's going to be it's actually going to be a TSP. Oh, another error in my slides. That'll be a new specification that will meet an update to the business requirements that the DPP have put through the specifications process. And I will pause to see if there's any questions on 35 p.m.
There are no questions at this time.
Seeing none, I will just very quickly put this slide up to say that the next block meetings are 11th to the 14th of March in White Plains, USA, hosted by SMPTE. After that, the 17th to the 20th of June, hosted by Magica in Tokyo. And then the next lot, just after IBC, hosted by Fraunhofer in Erlangen in Germany. And I'll leave this slide up at the end. And as I say, this will be distributed to the standards community, and you'll be able to look at a PDF of these slides afterwards. But without much further ado, John Footen, I will hand over to you to tell us all about our SMPTE microservices.
Thank you very much. All right, let me jump into it. I have a bunch of slides, but maybe I should talk a little bit first to just set some of the context. So microservices is an approach to integrating software systems. It is the general problem we're trying to solve is one that probably anyone who has been involved in systems for any amount of time understands quite well, which is that there are all kinds of ways that systems can be interfaced to different software products and capabilities. And the goal of a program like this is to standardize the way that we have our systems and software talk to each other. At a very high level, microservices is an approach to taking an interface and making it available in a agile fashion by creating a functional level interface to what you want that underlying thing to do. And I'll be stepping through that a little bit. But at the highest level, the problem we're trying to solve here is the complexity and maintainability of software systems in media. Okay, so this is the project that we're actually engaged in, the microservices project within. This is the project definition. Again, as I said, it's about interoperability of systems. Each of the documents that we're going to be creating in this will be covered by a different SMPTE project. There is a number of documents that will be created, and perhaps even the term document is not exactly what it will be. Effectively, what we're looking to do is create a document around the overall initial architecture, the approaches, the ways that this is supposed to work, the common things that all services must support. And then we are expecting a whole bunch of registrations, similar to the way the metadata project works, a whole bunch of registrations of interfaces that solve specific problems, that provide specific capabilities. So we see the key initial effort around defining both what those architectural requirements are and what are those common things that all software systems and services need to support, and then the process for registration. Again, in terms of the problem that we're solving, especially as we move into the cloud, there isn't any particular standardization that's happening with the interface of systems. This has been a long-term problem that has probably existed my entire career, if not before my career. And so we're hoping that this work will address that problem. And I talked about the scope of things. So key things that using an approach where the interfaces are more at the business or capability level is that it will allow for greater flexibility. Another one of the key things I should probably discuss, because I've discussed in SMPTE context before, is service-oriented architecture, and maybe I can briefly describe the differences between service-oriented architecture and microservices. It actually is a somewhat debatable question. The definition of microservices is somewhat debatable. Some people will argue that it's similar to the concept of atomic services that was used in the SOA world. Others will say that microservices are about total independence of the service, where a service-oriented architecture would envision a bus-like interface and common security services and common a lot of common databases and things like that. Whereas a microservice is about totally encapsulating all of the functional things that are needed into the service. It is a bit philosophical, and as part of this initial work, we are going to create a definition that will go forward from a SMPTE perspective. If you do create services, though, that are that well encapsulated, you do create flexibility. You can organize them and pass data between them in a way that is, particularly flexible for the purposes of a interface. The other thing that microservices do is allow you to more quickly develop. You create a smaller piece that you're developing in terms of software, smaller thing that it does, and that enables people to more quickly develop whatever it is that they're doing, and then these things can be orchestrated together at a higher level. All of this put together gives us a more flexible business environment going forward. Now, specifically in this DG drafting group, this is what we've been doing. We have biweekly meetings. We have a few different documents that exist inside the group. Those include a core document on architecture, actually a document that describes the overall philosophical points of things in the terms and definitions. We then also have an architectural document that we're using. I don't think my slides are advancing. There we go. And then we have an architectural requirements document. So the difference between those two is that the overall architecture is the big picture. The architectural requirements will be a rather technically specific document that will say this is what you must support specifically to make this work. You know, since these are early drafts, these things might be reorganized and recomposed as we continue to do the work. And then the last document is a microservices decomposition. This is basically taking all of the functions that exist in the industry, all the things that we do in media, and breaking them down, decomposing them down into smaller and smaller pieces. So what does it mean to edit video? You know, what are the subcomponents of editing video or selling an advertisement or whatever thing? And this covers both business systems and media systems, any sort of system that needs to be interfaced to this committee will be taking a look at. So we actually think this is, in my opinion, this is one of the most fun parts of this project, which we haven't dived into a ton yet, which is how to decompose all the things we do in the industry, just to define at a functional level what are all the things, so that we know what all the interfaces will eventually need to be. Short-term goals of the program, of the project, we've done, I think, a really good job of developing the documents as they stand today, but there are people primarily in the group like myself that are more, I guess you could say, theoreticians and architects more than people who actually have a lot of hands-on real-world development coding experience. We feel very strongly that before we could put out these documents that we're going to need them to be reviewed by people who are really developing these kinds of microservices to make sure that we're not saying something idealistically that is not realistic in the implementation or anything else that doesn't make sense in the real world of actually developing. We think we got a really good strategic framework. We've got good descriptions. We've got good justifications and a good sense of a bunch of it. But we really think we need to get some folks, other folks involved who have that key experience. So if anyone listening to this is able to contribute to this project, we would definitely welcome your involvement. And if you can reach out to any of us in SMPTE in this group, or Bruce or whomever, and just let us know that you're someone who's interested in microservices or services in general, we will definitely value your input as we try to work towards the first draft of these documents. We are defining clearly what is appropriate to standardize. We think to the point we were talking about earlier about security, we're wondering in the group whether that is something that really belongs in a wider security area rather than specific to this effort, because there's so much about it that is the same as security for all kinds of other functions. We're just sorting that through. We're sorting through what is the subcomponents of a software system that is appropriate for this group to standardize from a media perspective. Our long-term goal is to publish this suite of architectural documents that I mentioned earlier, and then to develop a process perhaps akin to the metadata registry, but we haven't really discussed it in detail about how it would work, so that contributors can register microservices with SMPTE. So we we want to, in order to speed this up, because there literally could be thousands of services that our industry will use. We don't want every single one to go through a comprehensive standardization process and document creation and all of that. We think that another type of process would be appropriate, and we have begun thinking that through. And one thing we're certain of is that we don't want this effort to take 10 years, so we know we're going to have to do something along those lines as we go through it. And I think that's all I've got. Any questions that I can answer?
There are no questions in the queue at the moment. I do want to remind our guests that questions are welcome, especially oral questions. You can unmute and ask the question. Well, tell me you want to unmute, and I will unmute you to ask the question. Also, if you don't have a microphone, feel free to type your question into the text. So
I was going to ask a question, Joel, while we're waiting to see if any of our guests answer. So, John, you posed a sort of a philosophical philosophical opener about what is a microservice. And, being somewhat involved in this myself, I know that some people have religious fervor on their particular opinions on what a microservice is. Do you think it's actually possible to standardize anything that will help clarify for the media industry alone, not for the entire planet, some good practice in the microservices domain?
Yes. So first of all, this is actually, this is ended up being the first big question we discussed in the group. And what we've come to actually is, in terms of what will be in the document, we have basically decided to reference the NIST definition for microservices. And the NIST definition is still high level enough that it doesn't indicate everything that you may want to know about how to actually build a service. But it does set the philosophical framework to some sort of approach. So we are referencing, in the current draft, we're referencing the NIST definition. We do expect to have a lot of definitional work, like so many other SMPTE projects these days, and so there will be a section that defines a lot of different terms. And then the document that we referenced that is about the architectural requirements is really going to be the one that says, hey, in our context, putting all philosophy aside, in our context, here's exactly what we're doing. Regardless of what words you want to put to it in terms of microservices or service-oriented architecture or APIs or whatever words, this is going to be the thing, the document that steps down and says, this is exactly how it has to work for a SMPTE microservice. So it kind of makes sense. So let me just quickly review those 4 documents. The first was just definition, terms, definitions. That's where the NIST definition, for example, on the term microservices exists. And then the second document was more the philosophical, why are we doing this? How is it being, what's the purpose? What's the basic components of a services architecture? The third one is the very specific, this is exactly what you need to do in the SMPTE world precisely to be doing a proper microservice from our perspective. And then the final thing was an industry-wide decomposition, so we can define what services we need made by somebody at some point. And we do expect that to perhaps be in the thousands of potential services when you look across all the things we do in media, from business systems to media systems, et cetera.
So my question really is, just to follow on from that, is that SMPTE is a global organization, and whilst many people live in the United States, other countries are available for living in. Why do you trust NIST? Because many people won't have heard of who NIST is.
That's so excellent question, Bruce. And perhaps a great reason to get some more folks involved. Right now, I believe most, if not all, of our participation is currently coming from the United States. There is no reason in particular to trust NIST or anyone else. We could write a definition, of our own for this word, but I think that's why, in a sense, these are just the words, if that kind of makes sense. I know words are important in standards, but there's a document that gets into the details. Like at the high level, this is services, right? We'll use the word microservices today. Maybe we'll call them nano services next week. But on our third set of the suite of documents is a specific thing that says you're going to use this type of XML or whatever it is, the JSON or whatever we decide is going to be put into there. And this is the core pieces of metadata that you have to carry in every service. For example, the job ID is an example of that. What job are we doing in an overall workflow? So those kinds of things will end up in that document. And I think that regardless of the words that we choose and that the industry evolves, because being in software for a long time, I think all of us have seen the words that we use evolve over time and still having a lot of common features in those things. We will provide enough detail in that third document that we think that will provide the compatibility. I also expect, Bruce, and this is something perhaps to discuss with you at some later point, that we will have to do some plug fests and all that kind of stuff that you need to do with any complex software stuff in order to ferret out all the incompatibilities and perhaps even in our words that we've written, the different interpretations that people can have. Certainly you've learned some of that with your MXF stuff, so we'll value your wisdom.
And I'm certainly looking forward to helping other people learn from the huge mistakes that I made.
Thanks, Bruce.
And just to echo, just to sort of close things off, is to say we really do need people to come in and join this effort, particularly if you're watching this on YouTube and you're not a United States resident. We need you. If you can use microservices in a sentence and people believe you know what you're talking about, please get in touch. Please join in. The more media experts who can code who join in this, the better the effort's going to be.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you very much, gentlemen. We have no questions in the queue. Do appreciate your discussion and your presentations. We will get this on YouTube, I hope, before the holidays begin. I know that's pretty close to happening anyway. But I do want to thank Bruce, Thomas, and John for the presentation. Wish you all three a very happy holiday season. I'd like to thank our guests also, and with the same holiday wishes. I've put a link to the online feedback form because your feedback is always important to ensuring that we are doing the right things at the right time and that we are of sufficient quality and value to you with these webcasts. So with that, everybody, take care, safe travels. Hope you get to rest over the holiday season and spend some time with your family or friends, if you have any. Joking. Take care, and we'll see you next time on SMPTE Webcast. Bye now.